So welcome everybody to this this Ask Me Anything AMA session with Dr. Gregory Shushan. Unfortunately, it seems we don't have any cameras on this Discord. It's a fairly new feature they've added, but it seems not to support cameras. Last time I did an AMA with Pascal Michael, for anyone that remembers, and that was on Zoom, but that caused some audio issues. So we've decided just to go ahead and do this now without camera. I can add some sort of graphics at the end afterwards for the video version of it. So I'm here with Dr. Gregory Shushan. So thanks, Doctor, for agreeing to come along. Do you want to just briefly give an introduction to everybody listening who maybe aren't familiar with your work, and just who you are and what your interests are?
Sure, yeah. My main area of research is cross-cultural afterlife beliefs, and specifically how they relate to near-death experiences. Also, to some degree, mediumship and shamanism, and most particularly, like any kind of experience where people claim to have experienced an afterlife sort of state or realm. So leaving the body, and also in shamanism, leaving the body, going to some other place and encountering spirits of their deceased relatives or friends, or deities, a being of light, and this kind of thing. So the idea is to look at these types of experiences cross-culturally and see how different cultures might have interpreted them or integrated them into their belief systems, and what kind of similarities and differences there are in different parts of the world. And I've written 3 books on this subject. The first one is called Conceptions of the Afterlife and Early Civilizations, and that compared ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, China, India, and Mesoamerica. And then I did a second one called Near-Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, and that was focused on small-scale, usually tribal societies, and Native Americans, African cultures, and the Pacific. And then that book is going to be actually reprinted in paperback next year. The first book, I'm going to have a new edition also next year in paperback from Inner Traditions. And then I have a new book, a third one called The Next World, Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. And that it kind of synthesizes a lot of the work of the previous ones, looks at near-death experiences more broadly, and then also looks at evidence from reincarnation and mediumship, and just kind of an overall look at the debates, really.
We have the first question from, as you mentioned earlier, from Twitter, and from what I can see, it is in regard to the AWARE study. Is that the one that you remember?
No, this one was here. In your research accounts from around the world, in your research of accounts from around the world, did you come across societies or cultures that did not mention near-death experiences? Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a trickier question than it probably sounds, because, for example, with ancient Egypt, there are no documentary accounts of near-death experiences. It's partly because the uses to which writing were put was very limited in early times of, when writing first appeared. So it was mostly for accounting, for bureaucracy. We have like laundry lists even, but there wasn't really like, personal narratives. There wasn't people writing down, today the weirdest thing happened to me. I got, run over by an oxen and I died and I left my body. That just doesn't exist. There's also religious texts and literary texts. So the way I kind of went into that material was looking at the descriptions of what the afterlife was thought to be like, looking at the Book of the Dead and pyramid texts and coffin texts, these guidebooks to the other world. So with that material, I kind of thought, what kind of descriptions of the afterlife are there that would correspond to a near-death experience? And so I kind of, can identify things like leaving the body, traveling through darkness and into a realm of light, and that's symbolically related by going through these sort of underground caverns, and then there's this succession of gates in the Egyptian underworld, and then they come into the daylight and they meet the sun god, who is the being of light. So it's all kind of symbolically expressed from, that's my argument anyway. So yeah, lots of cultures where there aren't overt near-death experiences, but you can possibly tease them out from their afterlife beliefs. But as far as cultures that we have better access to, either they're more recent or the language is better understood, or whatever, it's usually a case that there is some kind of evidence of near-death experience that's more overt. There was a study on out-of-body experiences in the 70s. Dean Shiels, I think, Shiels, in the Journal for the Society of Psychical Research, and he did this quite large kind of survey study of indigenous societies around the world, and he found that something like 95% of them believed in out-of-body experiences, and the reason they believed in them is because people within their societies actually had those experiences. So I would guess that it's fairly comparable to near-death experiences. There's very few that haven't expressed them, and if they haven't, it could either be because nobody in living memory has had one, but that doesn't mean that they don't have them as a culture. But it could also mean that there are inhibitions or restrictions on talking about them, which still happen today. People are afraid that they're going to be seen as crazy or kooky or something if they start talking about this kind of experience, even given how much we know about them. A good example of that actually is a lot of African cultures. Rather than, if somebody came back to life, it wasn't seen as, wow, my beloved relative came back to life and I'm going to go rush towards them and embrace them and weep with joy. It was more like, uh-oh, this corpse rose from the dead and it must be a victim of sorcery and it's a threat to society. So we better get out the rocks and the pitchforks or whatever. So there wasn't a lot of context in some of these African societies for relating a near-death experience and having a positive reaction to it. So I think sometimes when we don't have an NDE from a particular society, it might be for reasons like that it's not culturally acceptable. So people just don't talk about them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Doctor. So we have a question from Ronnie. I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name because I will get it wrong. He asks, hey there, first time viewing a live event on YouTube. One question I thought to ask was if there are any specific cases or findings that you found particularly interesting.
Wow, all of them in their own way. Yeah, there's so many of them. And what's I guess before I come up with a particular one, one thing that's been so interesting about this whole area of research is I started out thinking how amazing it is that there's all these similarities in all these different cultures with near-death experiences, and how amazing that they exist in these cultures, and how many can I find in all over the world. And then gradually I started thinking, actually what's more interesting in a way is the differences, because for one thing, if a near-death experience, however we interpret it, so if we say it's the dying brain or whatever, they should be more similar around the world. If somebody has a compromised brain and they're about to die or they die temporarily, and then scientists say NDEs are because there's a burst of activity at the end of someone's life, and therefore, all the circuits light up and it causes a life review. That's not a good argument as far as the cross-cultural differences go, because of the fact that life reviews are very, very rare outside of Western societies. And in fact, in Western societies, they're not that common either. Anyway, yeah, the point of all that is just, in a way, the differences are more interesting than the similarities because of the not only the cultural dynamics, but also, why are they different? There's an example I came across yesterday in my second book from the Tlingit people in the northeastern area of America and Canada border. And this is a lot of NDEs in some Native American cultures involve shamans. So it's partly the fact that they're shamans that enables them to have a near-death experience. I think they're more susceptible to these types of experiences. But then in some cases, they only became a shaman by virtue of their NDE. So they'd have an NDE and they'd come back and people would say, wow, he has this ability to go in this other world, so therefore, he has this kind of special status. But there's one example which we're not sure of the date. It was described in the year 1890, but it was said to have happened between 150 and 200 years prior to that. So it could be as early as 1690. So this shaman was ill for a long time, and then he died. And then he comes back to life a few days later. And he describes the experience of being outside of the body and sitting there next to his body. And he's not feeling any pain. And he's watching his mother as she performs funerary rituals and preparing his body for his funeral. And then he tries to tell her that he's not dead, that he's sitting there alive, and what are you doing? Why are you doing this to my body? I'm still alive. She can't hear him, and then he asks her for food because he's feeling hungry, and she still doesn't hear him. And then during the funerary ritual, he sees them making offerings to him, to his body. And then that satisfies his hunger because the essence or whatever of those funerary offerings are reaching his spirit. And it was at that point that he realized that he's dead. And so he thinks he has no choice but to proceed to the other world, to the land of souls. And here's an interesting thing about NDEs and small-scale societies. He doesn't then find himself in darkness rushing through a tunnel with a light at the end. He's walking along a path, along a road, and he can actually see footprints in the sand of other spirits that had been on that road back and forth. So again, there's this idea of, this difference is really important for materialist interpretations of NDEs, because a lot of them, going way back to early 90s and Susan Blackmore, that the feeling of rushing through a tunnel is a certain part of the brain constricting, it's lack of oxygen or whatever, and the light at the end is a visual, hallucinatory effect. But when you think that's not happening in this NDE, this guy's just walking along a road, it can't be explained by, the brain shutting down. So anyway, he's walking along the road, he sees a fork in the road, and by then he's really wanting to get to the other world. He says he longed to die and to see the country of the deceased. But then at that point he reaches a steep ledge, and if you recall from NDEs, there's often a barrier beyond which you can't cross, and he sees this ledge as the edge of the world. And he can see that below it there's a river that's rushing past, and the river he somehow knows is formed by the tears of the mourners who mourn the dead, which is a nice, symbolic image. I'm sure that's, not necessarily intended as an objective description. But then across the river is where the village of the dead is, and in that village he recognizes his deceased grandmother, he sees his uncle, and he sees children that he had tried to cure as a shaman, but was unable to. He tries to call to the dead, and they can't hear him, and so they ignore him. And so he decides to go to sleep. He falls asleep even though he's dead. And then when he wakes up, someone finally comes and ferries him across to the other side. So somehow this act of losing consciousness in the death state is what enables him to proceed to the next stage of his NDE. And then the spirits treat him kindly, but they also tell him, don't speak about anything that happened on Earth, which I think is an interesting one. That's a pretty unique thing to this. I've never encountered that before. I'm not sure why they wouldn't want to hear about things on Earth, because in other cases, sometimes they'll say, tell me about how my child is doing or whatever. And then the spirits they want him to stay. They're happy that he's there with them. But he starts discovering that he can't eat the food, that it's inedible, the water's undrinkable, and he starts seeing that the spirits have this very miserable sort of lifestyle. Even though they're happy and they're treating him well, it's almost like this kind of because he's not dead, he can't experience it in the way that they do. So, and then it gets a little bit more surreal here, almost kind of hallucinatory, and this is one of the things that really kind of grabs me about it. So he decides to leave, and he follows a path, and it leads beyond the river, and then he finds himself in a place where there are many hands growing out of the ground, and these hands are like moving towards him and waving, which is a really kind of surreal image. And he said it's as if they were asking him something. So he passes these creepy hands, and then he gets to a great fire. And at this fire, there's a sword that's swinging around, and many eyes are all over watching him, which is interesting because, you know, the fire is probably analogous to the bright lights that people see in NDEs. So at this point, he's thinking, okay, this is there's this dangerous sword and fire thing, and all these weird eyes watching me and hands coming towards me. What am I going to do? And he thinks, okay, I really don't like the spirit world. And on the other hand, I don't want to go back to Earth after all because my mother can't even see me or hear me. So he says, okay, I'm just going to end it all. And he decides to die a violent death because the belief was that if you die violently, you go to the realm of the Creator God. So he jumps into this fire and the swinging sword as it's revolving and suddenly finds himself back in his body, feeling the coldness of his body because he's been out of it so long and it's, you know, on the verge of decomposition. So I think that's a really interesting, you know, it's got all the kind of typical elements of an NDE, but in a very, very enculturated, very specific way. And then when he comes back to life, it's, you know, his people now believe, after his story, that more people don't return from the other world because they're too afraid of the hands, the eyes, and the fire, as he put it. People are too afraid. They don't know that if they leap into the hands, the eyes, and the fire, that they're going to come back to Earth. So it's got, you know, all these elements of NDEs, including the fact that it can lead to a change in religious beliefs and new kinds of ideas about the afterlife.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Doctor. So hopefully that was the sort of answer you were expecting there, Ronnie. Quite a detailed one, certainly. Anybody else, of course, that has questions who've just joined on the YouTube, just as Ronnie did, just leave a message there. Anybody that's listening in the Discord, if you have any questions, you can either there should be a raise my hand button. If there is, I can add you to the call to ask Gregory yourself, or you can leave a question in the lounge chat room would be the best place. Ronnie says thank you for the detailed answer, Doctor. So I think let's go back to Twitter because there was an interesting one. It wasn't really a question, but it was quite a current issue, and that's regarding the, as I said earlier, the AWARE study, and it was by I don't know, Iona. I don't want to butcher that too much. And she or he basically is saying, and I'll combine the two together, and that is quite important for anyone that doesn't know. The AWARE 2 study by Sampania, the results of that came out recently, and there was very, very anticlimactic kind of results. So Iona asks or says, the recent AWARE near-death experience study results are out. It showed that near-death brains experience much greater cognitive activity, not less, as one would expect. This could be evidence for near-death experiences simply being products of the brain, having nothing to do with consciousness being outside. Heightened brain activity, especially spikes in gamma brain waves near death, could explain why near-death experiences may be nothing more than just dream states, including recollections of life's memories, which could account for the classic life reviews. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, Doctor. Especially, I'm sure you're aware of the results that were posted.
Yeah, I actually haven't read the whole results, but yeah, I got it. I got the gist of it. Yeah, I mean, my response to that is really, I mentioned earlier about life reviews. I would like to know who, the people who come up with that argument that the burst of brain activity is responsible for life review. I would like to know two things. One is how many non-Western examples did they take into account of NDEs in general, and how many non-Western life reviews did they find? And then to explain why is it that some people have life reviews and other people don't when they have NDEs. And so this is not only between any two Western NDEs that we might read about. If you read any kind of collection of NDEs, it's not that every one of them has a life review. So first of all, they need to explain that. And then second of all, why is it that they just basically don't exist in some cultures. Some cultures that have, plenty of examples of NDEs, including many, many Native American cultures, just don't have any description of a life review. So if it's a burst of brain activity that's causing the NDE, that's causing the life review, then it should be happening to everybody. There might be a perfectly valid materialist explanation for it. Maybe it's that the ones where they're not reported, they weren't dead long enough. Maybe it's a certain kind of death or a certain kind of way the brain is compromised, or whatever. But basically to say burst of brain activity at the end of life is an NDE or is a life review is just completely speculative, I think. I think it's entirely speculative. Just as speculative as, or even more speculative than saying this person actually left the body and went to another realm. Because at least we have lots and lots of people who experienced it claiming that that's exactly what happened. We don't have anybody claiming my brain was dying and I had a hallucinatory experience. We have them claiming, no, this actually happened to me.
So great. So what I'll do, I'll bring up the specific results of the AWARE 2 study and just go over kind of what happened or what was shown. So I've got to find it on this website here.
It's the same argument that there was another study earlier this year about and it replicated a study on rats from a few years ago. They found that rats had this burst of activity, and then earlier this year they actually measured a dying person's brain activity, apparently for the first time, and found the same thing. And again, it's almost like if somebody were alive and you were to hook them up to an EEG or whatever and see that the EEG spiked, and it's a graph on the machine or on the paper, whatever. You can't say, oh, that person's thinking about eating ice cream, or that person's thinking about walking their dog, or whatever. All you know is that there was a spike. So,
from what I read, though, wasn't it that there wasn't a spike generally in total brain activity, but there was a spike in relative gamma. So, from the way I read it, and I might be wrong, is that brain activity was decreased as you'd expect, but there was relatively more gamma gamma waves were reduced a lot less than the other waves, and they attribute that. Is that right? Do you know?
I don't know, no.
Okay, not a problem. So the results from the AWARE 2 study, there were 567 patients that were studied. Only 53 survived to discharge from hospital, and only 28 were able to be interviewed. So of those, just to skip to the important stats, 11 of the 28 had memories or perceptions. 6 reported transcendental experiences of death. 2 reported cardiac-induced, it's CIPRIC, I'm guessing CPR-induced consciousness. 2 had memories post-CPR, and 3 had dream or dreamlike experiences. From those, so out of a total of 567 patients, and this is why I think it's very important to understand the context of sample sizes here. Out of those 567, 2 had auditory OBEs, out-of-body experiences, and 1 had a visual out-of-body experience. None of the 28 were able to identify the correct image, including the patient who had visual recollection. And 1 subject out of the 2 were able to identify the correct fruit from the auditory stimuli. So that is a potential hit, but we don't know the EEG readings alongside those. So that is the actual results of the study. And I think to say or to suggest that is suggestive that consciousness is all in the brain is a very big stretch to me, coming from 2 auditory OBEs and 1 visual OBE. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I would. I think that's, to me, there's just not really a lot you can say about it. I mean, there's not much to conclude. You mentioned there were 6 transcendental, what was the?
There was 6 reported transcendent experiences of death.
Which they don't give further details of that, huh?
No, it doesn't seem, not in this article anyway. This was on the awareofaware.co website. I didn't actually see the presentation, but I'm assuming that means that 6 of the 28 who had experiences those six had experiences of kind of the non-local aspect of the near-death experience, so going down a tunnel or seeing deceased people that can't be, veridical, that sort of part of the experience. That's what I think that would mean. Okay,
yeah. It's curiously inspecific, though. But I guess the study is not. I guess they weren't looking at who experienced a tunnel, who experienced a being of light or whatever, looking for vertical information in that way or comparative information. It was really just trying to measure, what's going on in the brain, I guess.
From Into the Psychic Realm, Dr. Shushan, do you have any thoughts on the ancient Greek wisdom, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die? And do you think they were referring to near-death experiences?
That's a great question. I think that's very likely that they were. There's a really interesting book on Christoph Hamp, and it's called To Die Is Gain. He was a German theologian, and the subtitle of that book is The Art of Dying Before You Die. And it's exactly the kind of he's getting at either experiencing a near-death experience or something analogous that's kind of brought on deliberately, a kind of, psychic or psychological type of near-death experience. It's almost like, practice for dying. And it's also, kind of mirrored in some Tibetan traditions. There are quite a few examples of near-death experiences from ancient Greece. There was even a term for people who came back from the dead. I can't remember I don't know how to pronounce it, but so I won't even try. But it's basically, the term means those who died and came back, essentially. And there's some from, ancient Greek and Roman examples. And I also think that ancient mystery cults, especially the mysteries of Eleusis and a couple of others, I think that they might have been like ritual reenactments of an NDE that for that specific purpose of dying before you die and having that experience so that you're then able to die with consciously and die with awareness, because they would essentially probably undertake some kind of consciousness altering activity, whether it was through drugs or something else. We don't really know. But they would then enter a dark tunnel and kind of be led through it in a way that was intended to mimic the journey of Persephone through the underworld. And then at the end, there was this revelation of a secret, and they would come out transformed in this new reborn kind of state. So, thematically and descriptively, it's all kind of, reflected in near-death experiences or reflections of near-death experiences. And it's really kind of, in a way, it's like ancient Greek shamanism, because a lot of shamanic traditions, like in a lot of Native American cultures, also involve, taking drugs or repetitive drumming and dancing until you pass out with the intention of going to the other world. And then you do it, and you have an experience that's very much like a near-death experience. And with the Native American examples, it's very overtly intended to have that beneficial experience when you come back for your everything else, that you come back with some kind of healing knowledge or precognition or something that's going to contribute to society, even if it's just to tell your people there's another world than this and it's better and you're not really going to die, that kind of thing.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. I have a hand raised from FH. So FH, I'm going to invite you to speak. You just have to click on the join button or something similar, and then you're free to ask the question.
Right, yeah. So I've heard somewhere before that there may be a release of endogenous DMT upon death. Is there any scientific evidence that this takes place? Could that be an explanation for some of the experiences that people have?
It could be. That's kind of more along the realms of Darren's previous AMA guest, Pascal Emmanuel. Yeah. I don't really engage too much in the sciencey part of things, more of the cross-cultural stuff. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all I can say.
As far as I can remember from what Pascal said, and I might be totally wrong, but I believe that it's never really been demonstrated that DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is the actual term of it, for those that don't know, isn't present. It hasn't been shown to be present in sufficient quantities as to allow for such an experience to take place. And although there are strong similarities between the near-death experience and dimethyltryptamine experiences, which was shown in a study by Charlotte Martial and Bruce Grayson, amongst others, in which they, if it was a schematic analysis, which means they had people who had experiences with drug-induced transcendental experiences like DMT and ketamine, etc., and also had those who had near-death experiences, and compared the language they used to describe it, and the results showed that dimethyltryptamine was very closely similar to the near-death experience, but that ketamine was actually closer. So if there is, I think, a neurochemical basis for causing these, it would be a concoction of both dimethyltryptamine as well as ketamine, and I'd imagine a variety of other drugs. I think it'd be very unlikely to say that DMT in and of itself would be the sole drug involved with a near-death experience. But again, the question is how do these drugs actually operate? Do these experiences, are they a result of the drugs causing some sort of mad brain activity to create hallucinations, or are they inhibiting the brain's filtration capabilities to allow more of real consciousness to come through? It's an open question, but I think no, DMT wouldn't be the sole cause. It may have certain aspects of it that are involved, but not in and of itself. And then it's a question of which other drugs can be shown to be intrinsic to the human brain that may be released at death. We don't know.
Yeah, and I think in Carl Janssen's study on ketamine, it was quite a while ago, he asked people who had NDEs and had taken ketamine how similar the experiences were. And apparently some said they were very similar, and some said they weren't that similar, actually. But another factor is just going back to these kinds of physical interpretations to begin with. I would then also ask, what are the actual physiological and psychological effects of DMT or ketamine or whatever? To what degree are they consistent between individuals? You have to kind of take it apart phenomenologically, because these drugs have, if predictable effects on people, whereas NDEs don't. So I guess that's what I would question is, even if they have corresponding elements to NDEs, is that predictable in everybody, including cross-culturally? And if not, then again, it needs to be kind of explained with a little more nuance.
I do actually have another question I'm quite interested in. But there are some reports of people who have negative near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. What kind of proportion of people tend to experience something more negative, and are there parallels across cultures amongst that group of people who have something more kind of darker, or in some cases quite scary, hellish?
They do exist. There's not really a lot of them. I don't know what percentage. For some reason, 2% pops into my head, but I don't know if that's.
I think it's a little bit more than. I'm trying to think back to when I read, and it was a while ago, Jan Holden and others, a handbook of near-death experiences. And I can't remember the figure. I know Dr. Gary Habermas puts it at a much higher percentage. He's a Christian scholar who researches near-death experiences, not from a Christian perspective, but just on the side of his other work. And I think he put it a little bit higher. I can't remember what that's based on. But it is a very low percentage, as you say. It's no more than maximum of 10% or something along those lines.
Right. And when you think that they, something like 15% of people who come near death have NDEs, so then if it's 10% of that 15%, it's pretty low. But But yeah, just I mean, I'm right now I'm proofreading my second book, Near Death Experience in Indigenous Religions, for the paperback, and so it's all quite fresh in my mind. And there's something like close to 100 Native American examples, and there's one of them that I would classify as negative or distressing out of all those. I mean, the one I talked about earlier, the Tlingit one, you could say it had some distressing elements to it, but overall, I don't think it would be classified as a negative NDE. There are a couple more in Africa that I came across, but I think that's probably the cultural context of the interpretation and knowing that if you die knowing that possibility of you coming back to life, you're going to be greeted with hostility and anger. There might be some fear involved with the NDE, which might help to kind of color the experience.
And of course, if we take if you believe, say, in astral projection, or if you've done research into that, a lot of people, and that's effectively inducing an out-of-body experience consciously and being able to travel these, quote, other environments, whether they are real or not, is of course up for debate. But in those kind of situations, people have always said that your mind, your decisions, your emotions, your belief system all greatly impact what you experience. It's a very liquid environment, and your mind is very much your mind creates the environments that you experience based on what you think at the time, what your beliefs are, etc., etc., etc. So if these near-death experiences are in a non-local or non-physical realm, if you want to say that, then it would make sense that it would be similar to that your mind and expectations will certainly shape what you do experience, or at least how you interpret that experience. I remember I think it was Jan Holden, talking about how many near-death experiences that were deemed to be negative seemed to be less that the ontological experience they had, the objective, you want to say, that objective experience that they had wasn't necessarily negative. It wouldn't be to somebody else who understands more about the realms and how they operate, but for someone that had no idea about that, or were brought up believing that once you die you go to heaven or hell, and clearly this wasn't heaven, so it must be hell, or they found themselves in the void, which is a dark place surrounded by, but not dark in a bad way, but dark, but like in a mother's kind of womb kind of dark, where you feel protected, you feel loved, but it's just a void. And people found that terrifying, and then they considered that to be hell, because of course that would be terrifying for anybody to experience.
It could be a bit like the ayahuasca trips, where sometimes people don't always have pleasant experiences, but they feel it's still beneficial in some way. It's something that was psychologically needed, or
Right.
It could be, yeah. I mean,
some of them. Sorry, go on, Darren.
I was just going to say that the end all and be all is that these kind of things we can't really investigate the meaning behind, especially in science, because these are, if they exist indeed, which they seem to, they're not objectively testable or objectively verifiable. They're completely subjective in a non-local environment. So I don't think we'll ever really get to the answer of why something is like this for some person and like this for somebody else, until, I suppose, we get there, until one experiences it themselves. And a lot of those who have out-of-body experiences and astral projections at will do so over many, many years. I'm thinking of, Jürgen Ziewer, for example, who's a very nice guy, wrote a few books like The Multidimensional Man, which, if you're interested in that sort of subject, worth looking at, who's mastered these things and has been travelling for years and years, including, Robert Monroe as well, is probably the most well-known guy. And they come to an expertise experientially of these realms to the level where they can understand why things are a certain way. But I think for those that, like us, prefer to go off of a scientific analysis of these things, I think we're going to be waiting a long time for that to be possible.
Yeah.
I do think that interpretation argument is compelling, though, because as you said, the void being experienced as loving and womb-like by one person and then terrifying by another, and I've also seen accounts where that have a lot of the typical features of an NDE, of a Western NDE, I should say. Rushing through darkness might be exhilarating for one person, but for another person, it's terrifying and you feel out of control. a being of light might be this, another terrifying authority figure that you feel judged and you're confronted with your bad deeds, and you're just going to feel like it's hell. But then there's also the argument that a lot of negative NDEs seem to be confusional and kind of hallucinatory. They don't seem to have the clarity and the meaning and the same kind of overall positive effect that regular NDEs do. So I think which calls into question that again, what exactly is an NDE? Should those kinds of experiences be seen as something else if they're not containing at least some of the typical features? I'm thinking of things like where people say there were hands reaching up from the darkness trying to drag me down, and that kind of thing.
Right.
Very, very idiosyncratic. It's not like...
I've just got one more question, if I may. So a lot of people, when they describe their NDEs, they describe them as being more real than real. They kind of feel them intuitively as not a daydream or not a dream. It's something that is as real as possible. Is that the normal kind of thing that people experience?
Yeah, I think that's pretty typical, actually, and that's reflected in a lot of the ancient and historical accounts, because there's never, well, I wouldn't say never, but there's rarely any question that it actually happened, or it's not seen as a dream. And in fact, a lot of the Native American examples, these cultures have a very clear distinction between this is something that happened, this is a legend, this is a story, this is a myth. They have these categories of narrative, just as we do. And near-death experiences are always in the category of something that actually happened. And it's also interesting that they will often say, I went to the other world, I did this, and I came back. They won't even talk about leaving the body. And then at the end, they'll say, and then there was my body. You kind of realize that they experienced as an out-of-body thing. But often when they talk about it, it's almost like there's no distinction between their consciousness, the reality of their consciousness, and their experiences happening and it happening in the other world. So to say, that's how real it is and how vivid and lucid, I guess, is the good word.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I think you could also kind of bring that forward to modern times as well, now that we have more of an understanding of not why dreams happen, we haven't got a clue, but, of maybe why certain types of dreams occur. Like we know how, we know that people experience lucid dreams, for instance. That's now a scientifically established phenomena. And yet people will still, something like a lucid dream, where if you've ever had one, it's effectively where you become conscious in a dream and you become perfectly lucid. But even so, there is a big distinction between the near-death experience consciousness and, even lucid dream consciousness. And because when you're in a lucid dream, you're in a dream, but you can control things. But in a near-death experience, people report that, this was as real and, as you say, more so than anything else. So we certainly even can't attribute it to lucid dreams, which a lot of people try to do, especially with out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would also just note that the near-death experience isn't the afterlife state. It's the transition to whatever might be after that. So, and I do kind of think that a lucid dream type state might be a good way to at least conceptualize what it's like to be in an afterlife world. It seems to make some degree of sense to me that it's kind of because the imagery and the visuals and the experience has to be kind of clothed with your own mind, because that's what kind of accounts for the cross-cultural differences, I think. Yeah, which is not to say that your mind is creating the entire experience, but you need ways of understanding it which are relevant to you and to your mind that you only mind you've had. So,
and I think no serious researcher who has come to the conclusion that these are genuine experiences, no researcher as such will deny that your mind and therefore your brain to some degree does have influence over what you experience, just not the core foundational experience is all in the head, all in the mind, which most researchers don't believe is the case.
Right. But then you've got some skeptics like Keith Augustine, for example, who says, the NDEs can't be evidence for an afterlife because they're so different, and because if there really is an afterlife, we'd expect it to be the same for everyone. It's like, really? Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're speculating on a nature of reality that we don't understand, where time doesn't even seem to operate the same way. It's not something you can conceptualize of. It's like trying to conceptualize a brand new law of physics. It could literally be any possible conceivable thing that you could imagine.
Yeah. And so the argument is basically, because it doesn't conform to my philosophical Western Christian influenced ideal about what an afterlife must be, then they can't be true. It's not even an argument. It's just a subjective judgment.
And that's fair enough, an opinion to have, from someone who hasn't researched deeply enough, which is why I have respect for folks like Dr. Gerald Verley. And although his integrity and his honesty have been questioned, he has done the work, and he does understand what he's arguing, and therefore is a very aware skeptic, I suppose, if you like to say that. But it's those who have strong opinions, despite how brilliant they are. I always use the example of Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a brilliant astrophysicist, but when he gives opinions on near-death experiences, something he's never really looked at as a specialist kind of interest. Regardless of how intelligent and how brilliant a scientist he is, isn't an informed opinion,
Right. Yeah, same with Sam Harris is another one. He had an article where he said, there's no near-death experiences across cultures. Like, oh, really? And then he said something like, if they're so different between southern India and northern India, then how can we say that there's such a thing as a near-death experience? It's like, well, because northern India and southern India are very different culturally, and there's dozens and dozens of cultures in India. So there's a kind of historical and cultural ignorance, I think, that a lot of scientists have, and that they don't understand the way that culture needs to be integrated into.
I see it seems to be that once they realise that near-death experiences are subjectively very different amongst different people from different cultures and different times, they therefore will conclude that it's all therefore in the mind, without diving kind of beneath the fabric of the differences to find the foundational similarities between them all, which is what kind of shows that they are more objective experiences as opposed to purely subjective ones.
Right, and it's also having their cake and eating it too, because if you can say near-death experiences are a result of a dying brain, that's why they're the same across cultures. Or they can say near-death experiences aren't even the same across cultures, so it can't be real. You can't argue both of those things at the same time. So, and I think that's why, it's really important to have some kind of, cultural and historical competence when you're interpreting these kinds of experiences. Like you can't just do it with materialist science. Whether the ultimate, argument or truth with a capital T is going to be materialist anyway, science alone isn't going to be able to explain any of it.
At least not science in the form that it's taking currently.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for your questions, FH. I'll call you FH. If that's everything, I'll now ceremoniously boot you out of the call. So thanks, FH, very much.
Thanks.
Okay, I see Panda in the Discord audience has a question, but before we get to you, Panda, I've had a couple of questions in the YouTube chat who've been patiently waiting. Both from the previous two questions, actually. Ronnie says he thought of another question to ask. Are there any good books about near-death experiences / related topics that you particularly would recommend for people to read? I can think of one off the top of my head.
All right, what is it?
I'll go first then. The Self Does Not Die by Rivers, Dervin and Smith.
Oh yeah,
which is, I think, a very important one for the veridical aspects of near-death experiences, which is, I think, 100 or up to 100 cases of third-party verified veridical perception in near-death experiences which show the objective nature of them. And kind of they veer away from the media popular book-selling cases that you've all heard about and brings in the more scientifically verified, scientifically researched and, you know, deeply background-checked experiences that kind of add a huge weight of evidence for me in that category. So that's the Self Does Not Die. So how about you, Doctor?
I think Bruce Grayson's new book After is an excellent introduction to NDEs, and kind of, you know, a very clear and engaging way of reading about phenomena in general, I think, and the scientific and philosophical debates and everything. If you're interested in the cross-cultural stuff, there really has not been a lot out there. James McLennan has written a couple of great books. One is called Wondrous Events, and that's a lot of that's about NDEs, and he talks about more recent African examples, as well as a few historical ones. He talks about medieval Europe and Japanese examples. And it's a really good book, and he discusses a lot about the experiential source hypothesis, which is a term that David Hufford came up with in relation to sleep paralysis. And it's essentially the argument that, despite the diversity of these experiences around the world, he could show that they have given rise to afterlife beliefs in many different cultures. So that's a good one. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too obvious in plugging my book, but my new one, The Next World: Extraordinary Experiences of the Afterlife. It's probably the most comprehensive as far as reviewing all of the cross-cultural evidence around the world, and then also putting it in the context of mediumship and reincarnation, and looking at, it doesn't go too much into the science, but it's more like, what are the cultural implications for the science and for the philosophical beliefs about whether there's an afterlife or not. And lots of references in that book too, by the way. There's a big bibliography. So
Into the Psychic Realm asks, do you have any thoughts as to the societal effects were there to be widespread acceptance that death is not the end? Would it make us treat one another better, or would we dissolve into nihilism?
Wow. That's a great question. I would probably have to say both. Probably, 50, 60%. 50, 60% of us might think, this is, we now have a wider view of our existence on Earth. We know that this is part of a grander process of spiritual, cultural evolution, whatever. So we're going to make the best of it. And then you're probably going to have another 40 whatever percent who's going to say, well, if I'm going to come back to life anyway, it doesn't matter what the hell I do. Just descend into the horrible behavior.
I think it would depend on those who kind of look at it as, well, this is the new fact that we have to live with, or would they use it as an opportunity to say, this is the new fact, let's investigate what that means a bit further. And if they were to do that, which a lot of near-death experiences have, and they're the people to look to, people that have had these experiences, because 9 times out of 10 they come out believing with complete certainty, or not even really belief, they call it knowledge, that they survived death. And the vast majority of them certainly don't become nihilistic. They become much more empathic, much more caring towards others, and they do that because they have an understanding of having been there themselves, not just from an understanding, a mental understanding, but from an experiential understanding. They have the context as to what that means and what that projects the universe to be, and why they're here. And therefore, a lot, such as Eben Alexander, go further down the rabbit hole to understand what that implies, knowing that you survived death, and they come back with so much more meaning and so much more life about them. So I think it would depend on whether you want to pursue that knowledge further and hopefully get to these same understandings.
Yeah, and as well as the fact that when people, just knowing when people come back and talk about these things, they do have a positive effect in society. I mean, if you look at people like Ibn Alexander or Anita Moorjani or whoever, these kinds of people have become very much like spiritual teachers and have these followings, and what they're telling people is really meaningful. I don't want to say it's a religion, but it kind of replaces religion for a lot of people. It gives them a new kind of spiritual orientation, and they could believe in an afterlife and believe in a different kind of spiritual meaning and progression for themselves without having to believe in a religion that they might not agree with in many other ways. And in a lot of the Native American and Pacific religious revitalization movements that were based around near-death experiences, essentially the same kind of thing. Somebody would die and come back to life, and they'd say, I had this amazing experience, and there's this great news, we're not going to die. And it would form this new kind of religious movement around it, which was, always had a positive message, like stop beating your wives, using the white men's weapons, stop using guns. And it's very much like this cultural renewal thing. So if you kind of extrapolate from that and look at, for the most part, NDEs already have had or do have a positive effect on society, and maybe a widespread acceptance of an afterlife, proof of an afterlife, would also have that kind of effect.
So I have a question from Panda. Same as with FHI, will invite you to speak. You just click on join, same as you did last time with Pascal, and it's over to you, Panda.
Hello, Dr. Gregory. Thanks for doing this. I have a question about cross-cultural NDEs. So I've read studies comparing Iranian Muslims and their NDE contents in comparison to Western NDEs, and they seem remarkably similar. So it seems to me that the contents of the NDE may not be based on culture. But on the other hand, when I look at your research, it does seem like contents of the NDE do depend heavily on culture. So I find myself confused. Could you clear this up for me?
I can try. I think, well, first of all, I wouldn't, I hope it's not coming across that I'm saying that they actually are based on culture, because that's not at all what I'm trying to do. It's more like the experiences are, as I said earlier, kind of clothed with culture. They're given cultural kinds of symbolism overlaid on objective experiences, things that are really happening. So, the most simplistic example of that is, did I see a neutral being of light as an atheist, or did I see Jesus as a Christian, or did I see Muhammad as a Muslim, or whatever? But is it all the same being of light? I just think it's been a while since there were a couple of articles on Muslim NDEs in Journal of Near-Death Studies. I don't know if those are the ones you're thinking of. It's been a while since I've read them, but I seem to recall that they were pretty similar, but they also were culturally interpreted to a certain extent. So, I don't think the differences negate the similarities. So, again, for example, the Tlingit account that I talked about earlier, there's this weird thing of swirling swords and jumping through fire. The fire is also this supernatural light, and as in Western NDEs, this light seems to help or to be a sort of transitional effect. I'm not talking about the being of light, but just the effect of light. It seems to be a sort of transitional thing. You emerge from darkness and into light. The guy still met his relatives in the other world. He didn't meet a deity, but he knew that the realm of the deity was there if he experienced a different kind of death. There were boundaries and crossings, and so on a very kind of thematic general level, they're kind of the same. They're just I don't want to say interpreted culturally, but because I think they're actually experienced culturally. It's almost like there's the event of an NDE, and the way you experience that event is different according to cultures. So I hope that makes better sense.
Yeah, but my problem is that when it comes to Muslim NDEs, at least when I read them, it doesn't seem like they're experienced according to culture. It seems like the contents of the NDE themselves, not the interpretation, but the contents, don't seem to depend on culture when comparing Muslim to Western NDEs. Like, there's still a bright light, there's still unconditional love, there's still a life review. Same typical stuff.
Right. I mean, it could be a cultural thing in the sense that Christianity and Islam are both Abrahamic faith. They're both historically grounded in the Old Testament. There aren't that many Jewish NDEs. There's one Israeli one that was published in Journal of Near-Death Studies, and that was fairly similar to the typical Western Christian ones as well. So it could just be a kind of monotheistic thing. I don't know. I think I would have to say anything specific about those Muslim ones. I'd have to look at them again, really. But I think a lot of it also depends on the degree to which they're elaborated and the context in which they happen. So if these Muslim NDEs were in a clinical setting and a modern researcher asked a modern Muslim what happened, it's very different than, say, a Native American telling a missionary or an anthropologist in the context of trying to explain their afterlife beliefs. They're going to elaborate on it, and they're going to express things in a symbolic way, even if they didn't even experience them in a symbolic way. So it might just be, that's probably an element too, that the context for relating it is more immediate, and it's a more modern kind of venue for being able to talk about it. Maybe that helps.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was my working hypothesis also.
Okay.
I had another question about NDEs and non-dual experiences. So how do NDEs and void or non-dual experiences relate? Do you find that these happen across cultures?
Yeah, they definitely do. I mean, it's a very much a common thing, especially like in Indian traditions and Hinduism and Buddhism. And they might be related. I mean, it might be that a similar state is reached through not necessarily dying. You can reach the same state being dead or not being dead. And that might be supported by the fact that, I still think near-death experience is not really a good term anyway, because people have what seemed to be a typical near-death experience when they're not at all near death. And, their body isn't physically in any danger. There was one example of somebody, I can't remember where I read it, but they were just sitting at their desk, a bright sunny day. Suddenly they found themselves outside their body, went to another realm, saw a being of light, and then they're back. And it was like nothing wrong with them at all. So
it also commonly happens, doesn't it, when someone's afraid of being, impending dead. There's a case of a guy who was falling off a cliff. He wasn't in any immediate state of death, but he believed that he was about to be killed, and that fear triggered a near-death experience, despite not being physically near death.
Right. Yeah, and they sometimes call them fear-death experiences. But yeah, those are interesting because falling off cliffs and also drowning or thinking that you're going to drown, they happen in those cases as well. But in those cases, there's more often a life review, and maybe not many other NDE experiences. So there's something about that, your life flashing before your eyes, quite literally when you think you're going to die.
I know that in those sort of cases as well, time seems to behave very strangely as well and seems to slow down.
Right, yeah, that's true too. But if you think about it, the space between being at the top of the cliff and landing isn't a lot of time to have a full-blown NDE anyway. So it's probably something. I mean, that, I think of all the physiological brain-based explanations, that's possibly the most compelling, that it's just the fear is triggering some barrier in your brain to release, and all your memories are flooding in. So
I could go along with that, yeah. The psychological trigger.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned drowning, because a close family member of mine actually had a life review while he was experiencing drowning as a child. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, there might be an association there.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more research done on that. And again, it's like another problem with the cultural and the descriptive and phenomenological things. Like everything is just called a near-death experience. I don't know if we should call it a near-death experience if somebody just has a life review when they almost drown.
I think the study I read by Charlotte Martial had a decent kind of classification, but a very vague one in the sense that near-death experiences she defined as those that took place, physically near death, and everything else was near-death-like experiences where, although they may be phenomenologically or experientially the same, one occurs near death physically and one doesn't, which would include the fear-death experience and maybe those experienced by fighter pilots and things like that.
Right. Yeah. And in my work, the only criterion I really have for considering something an NDE is if, indigenously speaking, the people at the time thought that person died, because we don't have any way of measuring if some random individual in ancient China was really dead for a period of time, like they said. So yeah, I'm not saying, oh, it's not an NDE because he didn't leave his body, or it's not an NDE because he didn't meet a relative or whatever. It's whatever the experience, whatever the description is, I count it as long as there's that near-death context. And by the same token, if there's an experience that seems very much like an NDE, but it was caused by a shaman taking drugs, I don't count that a near-death experience. That's a shamanic experience that has near-death-like features to it. Yeah.
All right, so I just have one final question. Do you think that enlightenment-related experiences and NDEs have some kind of overlap?
What kind of enlightenment experiences are you thinking of?
Like mystical states, deep mystical states, those of pure consciousness and so forth.
Yeah, I would say that they definitely do. I think they're of the same category of experience. But it is interesting that near-death experiencers don't often talk about that contentless state as in mystical types of experiences. They have these very definite features that they can talk about, which are conscious experiences of beings and places and spaces around them. They can say it was like a tunnel or it was like whatever, whereas the contentless mystical experience is it's something different. And it's an interesting question how that would relate to an NDE. It could be that's what we're heading towards after the NDE stage. I don't know.
I would think neurologically there's a similarity because in both cases the default mode network, empirically speaking, we know that during mystical states the default mode network goes offline, and the NDEs obviously goes offline as well. So that might be an interesting thing to look for.
Yeah, that's true. But then, the question still remains: why would they be so different in being described as contentless and being described as packed with content, basically? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting questions.
Okay, so while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, there is Marco B brings up a good point on his second statement here that it's quite widely accepted that there is some sort of afterlife in society as a whole, but it is very much not discussed in public and very, very little in academia, which could be, I suppose, why we've made so little progress on actually asking or investigating the question. Do you find in your circles in academia that this kind of thing is looked down upon, and what do you think that means for the field of consciousness and after death research as a whole?
That's a good question. The funny thing is I started out in Egyptian archaeology and then did my MA at Institute of Archaeology at University College in London. And that's when I started doing I started with a comparison of Vedic India and I'm drawing a blank, ancient Egypt, and their afterlife beliefs in relation to near-death experiences. And I had nothing but support, and there was no hint of like, no, you need to defend this, you need to conceptually define this, and it was just completely supportive and open-minded. And it was only when I moved into religious studies to do my PhD at Lampeter, not Lampeter itself, Lampeter was great, but within the world of religious studies, especially with critical theory, was there this like risk of being seen as a crypto-theologian, they as one of the buzzwords, or that I was smuggling theology into religious studies, because religious studies is, secular study of religions. It's basically anthropology or sociology of religions, effectively. So yeah, I mean, any hint, first of all, even the idea that there could be a type of belief that's based on a certain type of spiritual experience was, this anathema subject to talk about. Because if you say that there's a type of experience that's cross-cultural or universal, and people are basing their beliefs on it, their religious beliefs, and that suggests there might be a thing called religious experience. You can't be talking about religious experience unless it's culturally generated through meditation or prayer or whatever. So everything has to, the default is everything is culture. If you start leaning towards, well, maybe everything isn't culture, because how else can you explain the near-death experience or out-of-body experience or whatever else? Yeah, there's a lot of blowback to it. So it's difficult. And you would think that in a field called religious studies, you'd be open talking about things like this, but it's difficult. And anthropology, I think, has been a bit more open-minded as well. It's not as constricted by theory, and I think maybe with religious studies and theology, they're so concerned to distinguish themselves from theology that they maybe go a little bit too far sometimes.
Mm. Well, aren't there beliefs amongst, I suppose you could say your colleagues or people that other people that study this kind of thing, that documents and like the Bible and religions like Christianity and indeed Jesus's teachings himself could have stemmed from such an experience?
Yeah, that's, theologians might go there, but not a religious studies scholar. You're not, any kind of religious experiences is just seen as part of a cultural practice. So the idea that there's a spontaneous experience, you just can't talk about it. And it's largely influenced by this kind of constructionist, postmodernist school of thought. Some of it is admirable because the idea is we don't want to impose our evaluative terms, such as religious experience, on these other cultures. And we don't want to see all cultures as being the same and see them as being like us. So we need to preserve their uniqueness and their identity and not be cultural imperialists the way we've been physical imperialists. But really, that goes too far, because then the effect is basically saying that these people are not telling the truth. The people who are giving us our information, the person who said I had an NDE and went to another world, we're evaluating that by saying if they didn't, it's only part of your cultural tradition. So even that, it's tricky, because I can kind of see where they're coming from, but I don't think they're correct. I think it's just the opposite. I think denying the voices of the people we're studying is far more damaging and dangerous politically than accepting what they're actually saying, because it might risk that there's a common spiritual type of experience. So I had an interesting run-in in academia about this. I wrote an article about this, specifically arguing how out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences challenge that kind of thinking, because they're identifiable experiences across cultures. And I mentioned sleep paralysis too. Sleep paralysis is a physiological phenomena. It's been identified, but it leads to religious beliefs that are similar, or spiritual beliefs in different cultures. And so I wrote this article in a journal called Method and Theory in the Study of Religions, and the editor wanted to make it like a special symposium issue, and he invited 3 or 4 of the scholars that I had critiqued in this way, and all of them said yes, we'll participate, we'll write responses, and then I would be able to then write a reply to them. Once they saw the article, every one of them backed out without a word. They just said, no, I'm not doing it. So I thought that was really interesting. And I still don't know why. Nobody who argues for this type of thing has engaged with that article or another one I've written on it. And actually, I adapted it for the new book as well. Nobody's argued against it. So I'm really curious. I would really like some blowback from it, actually.
Indeed, rather than just have it ignored, what good's that going to do?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we have a hand raised from Slinky, so if you'd like to jump in and join the call.
Hi, Dr. Shushan. Thanks for speaking to us this evening. I'd just like to ask, do you have any kind of background information on people that are born without eyesight or other sensory impairment, and then obviously going into a near-death experience and maybe having access to things that they wouldn't have in their earthly life?
Yeah, there are quite a few examples of NDEs in people who were congenitally blind, and they had full-blown visual experiences for the first times in their lives during NDEs. Yeah, they're pretty compelling. There's a book about it. Do you remember the name of the book, Darren? I know Kenneth Ring wrote an article on, and it's called something like Near-Death Experience in the Blind, and that was for the Journal of Near-Death Studies. But I believe there's also a book which might be by him. But yeah, that's difficult to explain in any materialist kind of terms, because I wonder if any other kind of traumatic or drug experience or any kind of hallucinatory experience would make a congenitally blind person have visual mental experiences for the first time.
Oh, here it is. It's Mind Sight by Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. And then I think that was kind of around the same time they started realizing that children also have NDEs, children who had not been indoctrinated into any kind of religion, and still had full-on NDEs. That, to me, that's a little less. It's interesting, but it's a little less interesting because in today's society, you can't escape ideas about death and the afterlife, and even if someone's not a Christian, it's very much permeated in society. So I think even a 5-year-old kid would probably have ideas about dualism and from watching cartoons or whatever. There's a Simpson episode where Bart Simpson leaves his body. And
Thank you. I had a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Hmm?
Sure. So in the Christian story, as it were, we hear of Jesus encountering John the Baptist, and it sounds to me like there's some sort of ritual going on involving submersion, and I'm just wondering whether you have any insight or opinion on whether that is potentially some sort of induced near-death experience ritual.
Wow. I'd never thought about it in that way. I mean, just like the idea of submersion being a metaphor for going under, essentially, and
or oxygen and starvation, like a literal, an event or a thing that maybe they did to induce near-death experience. Just on the back of what you were talking about earlier about these things potentially being the genesis of religions and people coming back and
right,
evangelizing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that I don't really know. It's an interesting idea that I've never even thought of. But sure, I mean, if you look at it in relation to, like I was saying about mystery cults or whatever, where you go through this process of basically artificially inducing a kind of NDE. I guess that would be possible. But the thing that's interesting to me about Christianity is, the whole religion is based on the death and miraculous return of one man. But why don't we hear about what happened to him in the meantime? He basically had he didn't. We don't know if he had an NDE, Jesus, but he had a death and return. And I just think it's really strange that we don't know what happened in the meantime. There is an apocryphal text called the Harrowing of Hell, which tells about his descent to hell during the time that he was, dead from being crucified and coming back to life. But yeah, who knows? I just think that's one of the many mysteries about Christianity. And there's also, looking also at the Old Testament, there's a few examples of people being rising from the dead, but we never get to hear if they had any NDE while they were in the dead state.
Okay, so that looks like the end of the question. So we should end here if you're happy with that, Doctor. Unless there's anything else you wanted to touch upon before we go.
Not that I can think of. No, I think it's been a good conversation.
Great. So where can people get in touch or find more of your work if they have any further questions or would like to look more into your work?
Various places. I'm on most of the social media. If you just search my name, you'll find me. My website is GregoryShushan.com, and there's a few free articles and stuff on there. Information about my books. My new book, The Next World, is on Amazon or wherever else you buy books. And I also have a Patreon site. I'm an independent scholar, so I kind of do all this out of interest rather than out of salary. So that's a way, if you're willing and able and interested in supporting my work through Patreon. There's things like the historical near-death experience of the month, and I put links to whatever kind of activities I'm doing, and you get a thank you in my books and various other kinds of benefits there. And at the moment, you can get a free book I'm giving away, either a copy of The Next World or another book that I contributed to called The Crossover Experience with Pim Van Lommel and DJ Kadagian, and yeah, stuff like that. It's always changing.